Good evening. I'm the Reverend Denbray Archie, pastor of Zion Fountain AME Zion Church in Stockton, Alabama. I stand this morning to give you a brief history of our church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. It had its beginning at Jones Street Church, which was the first Methodist church erected in that city. There were several colored members in this church from its first organization. Between the years of 1765 and 1796, the number of colored members largely increased, so much that Chase prejudice forbade their taking the sacrament until white families were all served. This and the desire for other church privileges denied them, induced them to organize among themselves, which they did in the year 1796. Among the leaders of this movement were James Barrett and Richard Allen. The latter subsequently moved into Philadelphia and set up a similar organization called Bethel. Barrett was the first African Methodist Episcopal church of which we have any account, and we attribute its founding to James Barrett, who was the first bishop. In the year 1800, they built the church and called it Zion. This church, unlike the other colored Methodist churches formed about the same period, was, as regards its temporal economy, separate from the Methodist Church from its first organization. They drew up articles of agreement which the Methodist Episcopal Church, under which she supplied them with ministers for about 20 years. So that Zion, the oldest church of the connection that has by general consent taken her name, must be conceded to be the oldest Methodist organization separate from the Methodist Episcopal Church in this country. As we have shown, the connection is generally called Zion out of respect of that first church. But the style and the title of the church, as the founders tell us, is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And if there is any other body of Methodists in the world that has a permanent right to this title, it is the Zion Connection, for she assumed it before there was any other to assume. That is just a brief history, look back at our history of our organization. But over the years, we have evolved into 12 Episcopal districts that oversees all of the known continents of the world except for Australia. Out of those 12 Episcopal districts, we are in the Alabama-Florida Episcopal District, which is overseen by the Right Reverend Seth Olarte. Out of the Alabama-Florida Episcopal District, it is divided into 8 annual conferences. Out of those 8 annual conferences, we have the South Alabama Conference, and out of that South Alabama Conference, it is divided into 2 districts. Those 2 districts being the Greenville District, which is overseen by Reverend Mark Hawkins, and the Bruton District, which is overseen by presiding elder E.G. McCaskill. Reverend McCaskill oversees 14 churches, one of which is Zion Fountain AME Zion Church in Stockton, Alabama, where I serve as pastor since 2019. We continue the work of the gospel to win souls to Christ, promote kingdom building, and uplift fallen humanity through teaching, singing, and preaching, combined with community outreach and missions which demonstrate the gospel. We continue to do this through our vision of educating our children, empowering our families, developing our communities. We do ask you to, whenever you're in our community, stop by Zion Fountain AME Zion Church in Stockton, where we are here every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for our Sunday school service and our worship service, which begins at 11 o'clock, where we are praising and worshiping our Lord and continuing the work of spreading the gospel for Jesus Christ. Thank you.
My name is James Dillard Williams. I'm a member of this church. I grew up in this church from a child to an adult. I currently serve as a trustee and an adult Sunday school teacher. You've seen earlier that my pastor is the Reverend Denbray Archie. He was appointed to this church as of October 2019. He is a God-sent man. He is moving the church forward in a spiritual manner. I love him, I respect him, I think he's doing a great job, and I think that we have not seen the height and the soul of this church as envisioned by him. But I look forward to that coming into pass. I want to reference some of the senior members of this church. One in particular is Mrs. Anna O. Robinson. She was one of the oldest members of this church. I grew up under her tutelage. Her mother owned a store that was in walking distance from this church. She was also my first cousin, but she passed away last year, and we miss her very much. She used to sing in the choir. We had a senior choir at that time. She had a very good voice, and she's been very instrumental from the foundation of this church to its current being. I also want to speak on behalf of Mrs. Serena Edwards, who just passed, I guess, less than a month ago. She actually was the oldest surviving member that I can remember in this church. She lived to be 99 years old. She also was a member of the senior choir. She was really the very best dressed woman in this church. She loved her hats. She wore one every Sunday. She knew how to wear a hat better than any woman that I know, including my wife. And I know she's probably going to get me for that, but she just have to excuse me because I believe it to be true. There are other members who have passed on, crossed over. I also want to tell you about one of our long-serving presiding elders. His name was the Reverend H.K. Matthews. He served this church in that capacity for a number of years. I can't recall exactly how many. However, he was not just a presiding elder, he was a pioneer. He was a civil rights activist. He journeyed through many struggles, including going to prison for his activity as a civil rights activist. He has written a book. He is now retired as presiding elder, but he's still very active in the Zion Connection.
My name is Annie, and I would like to tell you a little bit about our church. Our church was originally located where the present-day cemetery is. A few good Christian people decided that they wanted to build a church on that site. Later, the church, we were able to gather information by a lady who was a member of the church at that time, Miss Julia Stephen, who told us bits and pieces about the church, and that said that it was organized in 1873. We moved the church later to the present-day location. Some of the first trustees of that church were Mr. Gaston Hill, Colin Horace, and Mr. G.L. Washington. These people formulated this church, and the pastor of that church at that time was Reverend Burke, and Reverend Oliver was the first presiding elder. I united with this church at an early age, and I am now 70 years old, and I function as a treasurer right now, and I've held various positions. This church has many pastors and presiding elders and bishops. Our church united with the AME Zion Connection many, many years ago, and we are now still a part of that organization.
Hi, my name is Velma Baker Smith, and I'm the child of Annie Mae and James Baker, who lived in Stockton, Alabama, and I'm currently still living in Stockton, Alabama. I grew up in this church of Zion Fountain, AME Zion Church. I've been here for 68 years. My mom, her name is Annie Mae, and she was one that taught us to love everyone, to be kind to people, to always know that we are loved. Most of the time, my father died at an early age. He was not such a great churchgoer, but he made sure that we got to go to church. One of the main things that happened at our home was that we had to go to Sunday school. Sunday school was very important to us because it was the foundation that was set for us. We were a very close family, and right now, all of our family members, except the ones that lived off in other states, attend this church. We are a loving family. When I think about my mom, I think about the times when she would bring food to other members. She would carry foods to other families, other church members, and even just not our family, but other people in the community, because that's one of the things that our church would do. During fellowship time on Sunday fellowship, we used to go on the grounds, out here on the grounds, and they would serve foods for us. Different members brought in different dishes, such as collard greens, black-eyed peas, potato pies, corn, all of those good things that we shared. And when we shared in the fellowship that we had, it got us to know each other. We had a chance to play games with other children, and that's how we got so close in the community. Everybody was, it was just one, it was just a oneness, because, and that's in the church as well, because we knew that if one did not have, the other had, and we would share those things like that. My mom served in the choir. She was a quiet lady, but she was a spiritual lady. She made sure that we knew God, that we had Bible study at home. We did different activities at home as far as the Bible is concerned. And this is one thing that we do now in our home. When we visit each other, this is the things that we do because we learn those things at church.
Hi, I am Roberta, and I'm going to tell you what I remember about Zion Fountain AME Zion Church. To start off with, my grandmother always told me, when you talk to people, don't just tell them you're from an AME Zion Church. Let them know what AMEZ stand for. It stands for African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. She always told me to make sure just those initials does not work. You let them know exactly where you came from. And the reason for that is because her father, my great-grandfather, was the pastor here. He pastored for 2 years. And they left and came, when they left, they had my grandmother and her sisters called the Hodges girls. It was 4 of them. 2 older ones was 12 and 1 was 14. My grandmother was 3 when she had to come back, and my aunt was 2. The reason they came back because their father had passed. So they had to stay with their sisters. They raised them. And my grandmother said when she was coming up, she would always play jokes on people. She was going to get a whooping. Back then, they didn't believe in sparing the rod and spoiling the child. They had to do their Bible grace before they eat. So my grandmother loved to play jokes on them. She would always say, Jesus wept, Papa fell out the back door step. And that time, one of her sisters said, you finna get a whooping, Ailey. Matter of fact, my grandmother's name is Ailey Hodges James. And she said, She said, I'm finna whoop you because I told you do not play when it's time to say grace. That's serious. So she ran out of the house and ran into the church. And they couldn't find her. So when they found her, they heard something in the church playing. They were like, what is that? Who is that? Oh, it's a ghost in the church. And she was in there playing. She said, I got to do something to keep from getting a whooping. So she decided to get on the piano, and she was playing a song. They said, sound like angels. I don't know. I wasn't there at the time. And anyway, she started playing the piano when she was a very young child because she did that to keep from getting a whooping. Well, the fast forward to that, she always wanted us to sing in the choir with her. And I was like, okay, we can do it. My sister, it was 3 of us. My brother, he wouldn't do anything. Anybody told him. But my sister and I said, we'll sing in the choir, in the children's choir. That's the reason I don't sing today. We were singing this song, and I can't remember the song, but it say, I looked at my hands and they looked new. I looked at my feet and they did too. But we wasn't saying that. We were saying, I looked at my hands and they were split in two. Well, you know what that meant. We got a whooping. And so my sister said, we gonna get out this choir when we get old enough and we not gonna sing again. She did, but I didn't. I made a promise I wasn't gonna sing again after I got a whooping about a song, because we love to play jokes too. Miss Clara Baker didn't pull my ear. She another one didn't believe in sparing the rod and spoiling the child. She tore us up. I have to get up and do a report. And she will say, get up again and do it, because you said it too flat. And I made a promise then, if I ever get grown, you won't catch me back up in Sunday school. I kind of stuck to that promise too. But that's the way it was, you know. But my grandmother played the piano, and she tried to teach us to play the piano. Like I said, 3 of us, we never showed any interest in playing. But she could, and I loved the song that she would always play, was Touch Me, Lord Jesus. And she told me before she died, she said, well, you learn how to play nothing but one song, and I did. And nobody in this room know that today, until now, that I learned how to play one song, because she wanted me to follow in her footsteps. But other than that, no. But I did, my grandmother had a set of twins, which is my mother. My mother died when she was 43, and I was 13. So that's why my memories are more with my grandmother than my mother, because I was a child. And like I said, my great-grandfather was the pastor here, and when he passed away, they came back, and we've been here ever since. I was born in 1954. That's the day I joined, because we didn't do no baptizing children then. They said we christened children. I was christened when I was a baby, been here ever since, and that's where I intend to die, buried here.
I myself can remember when people who came to this church didn't have cars. Matter of fact, everybody used to walk to church. The streets that you see in front of this church now are paved, but they were not when I was a child. I came to this church involuntarily as a child. My mother insisted that we come to Sunday school, that we come to church, that we come to evening service, that we come to Sons of Eric meetings. As a matter of fact, I didn't even like church when I was a child, simply because I didn't have a choice in the matter. However, I grew to love church. I grew to understand the meaning of church. And I had many, many people who were a part of this church who helped me to matriculate into that understanding. One in particular I can remember when I was a child, there was a lady by the name of Miss Clara Baker who taught the youth in the church from a catechism. Now, this catechism that I'm mentioning is a book for the young people to learn about the spiritual side of their being. The first thing I can remember out of that catechism, and I still remember to this day, is, who is God? The answer was, God is a spirit, always was, always will be. Second question that she would always drive home is, where is God? God is everywhere. And then, of course, who made you? God made me, and he made the heavens and the earth. That's just a reference from my very beginning in this church. And I grew to know more and more about the spiritual side of my being, and it has helped me throughout life. There were other older people in this church who have crossed over. One in particular was Mr. Junior Williams, who was our Sunday school superintendent. And the funny thing about Mr. Junior was he had false teeth. And when he talked, his teeth moved. I guess they didn't have anything to keep him secure at the time, but he was always here on time. Sunday school was always ready to begin when we came, and he was very instrumental in my learning process. Also, there was a lady by the name of Miss Julia Bryant, a lady by the name of Miss Sarah Washington, and also a gentleman by the name of Leslie Kelson and Calvin Anderson. These people were very instrumental in my spiritual growth in this church. And had it not been for them and the stern hand that they applied, I might not be standing where I am today. But far more over all of them was my mother, Mrs. Ruthie Mae Williams Porter. She insisted that not only I came to church, but all of her siblings, all of my siblings, they had to come. She had one rule: go to church or you won't go nowhere else. So in other words, if you didn't get up and go to Sunday school and go to church, you were stuck at home all day long. I referenced to the fact that most people walk to church. Well, in my childhood, we had to walk approximately 2.5 miles to get to this church from where we resided. On the way to the church was a little country store run by my cousin, Mrs. Annie Robinson. That is the mother of the lady that I mentioned, Miss Anna O. Robinson. Well, she had a little store, and of course, we had nickels, dimes, pennies to put in church. We were given that money to put in church. Well, I cheated God, because most of the time we would end up putting the pennies in church, save the nickels to go back by the store and buy a treat on the way home. But I know God has forgiven me for that, because he's still blessing me. He's blessing me very fruitfully. Of course, I'm married. My wife is a member of this church. Her name is Annie Baker Williams. We've been married 35 years. We have 2 children. One, Anthony Williams, who's a police officer in Mobile, Alabama. The other one is Herman Williams, who resides in Detroit, Michigan. We have 5 grandchildren. They all have been a part of this church, because just like my mother before me, I insisted that they come and give God some of their time.
My name is Joe Melvin Horace, and I'm the oldest male currently living in Stockton today. And I'll be 90 in July of this year. I'm 89 now, 90 in July. And I can remember back, a lot of people that talking about the church itself, when shortly after it moved out of the cemetery some years later, that we had animals and things like that this community was running. There wasn't no stock law at that time. And the thing of it is, we had animals and things that's walking the street through the cemetery and everything, and we had to come out, and during the springtime, we would have to come out and clean up around the churches, in the cemetery, in the schools and everything. And we had a school, a wooden school across the street from the cemetery. That was always a symbol of progress in this community. And from there on, we had the mill. I don't think anybody ever mentioned about what we did for a living. We did a lot of farming here. It was a farming community, and we worked at for public work. We had the Bacon Underwood Mill at that time, and most of our people worked here, and they done logging. That's another thing. This community, we had rivers everywhere around here, and they done logging the whole, just about him. My father was a logger. He never learned how to swim, but he stayed on the river on logs all the time and never did get drowned. That was a good part about it. Yeah, so from there on, everything we did here was practically by hand. And that was one of the most important things. You had to go in the fields, you had to go to work, and we would ride from Stockton to Foley, Summerdale, Robberdale, all that, and pick up white potatoes in the old days. And I'm talking about back at the time, and we didn't have lights anyplace. And at this church, particularly at this church, we had a Delco that we had there, a motor gas ran Delco that we used for lighting inside of the church. And before that, we had lamp lights in the church. And here at this church and Triumph Church, we were so closely related, and church people would come, we would go to Triumph, and Triumph would come to us. That's a church just about a half a mile away from here. And all the kids, everybody in the community, even when we didn't have light, they could walk from place to place at night, and you wouldn't believe it, that they could almost tell by the sound of the person walking who they were meeting and passing. It was just that close. It's amazing that the people could do that. But on everything we did was family done. If anybody needed anything, we didn't lock our houses, didn't lock the church, we didn't lock anything at that time. I mean, everybody was free to come to church. If they wanted to come out and pray or do whatever, they could come out and pray. And we had same thing, we had a bell here, I think it had been mentioned before, But anytime anything disaster, anything happened, the bell was ringing. And the same thing about the meal that we had in our community. It would tone for twice in the morning for dinner and for getting off at 3 or 4 o'clock in the evening. And this was all done year round. Nobody, because we didn't have very few watches, some clocks, but very few watches and things like that. And as far as transportation is concerned, at one time, Mr. Ed Robinson, we've heard of Mrs. Robinson, who had the grocery store. He, my dad, and there was 2 more men had cars. And they used to carpool to Bay Minette to shop on Saturdays. That was the only day that anybody ever had time enough to go from place to place was on Saturday. And the thing of it is, Saturday was a beautiful day in this community because we had ball games and they would come from Pensacola, Mobile, every place over into Stockton to play ball. It's amazing how that was in the old days. And nobody had any place to get in place, but they would go anyway. You know, they find a way to travel. And so from there on in, coming back to the church again, this young lady that Jessica was talking, her mother, Mrs. A. Lee Jones, was our pianist for many years. And she played music for the senior choir, the junior choir, and the youth choir. But the thing of it is, I really liked during the time when I was small, very small, that the young ladies she would play swinging music for them, and then she'd sing the old hymns that we had at that time. And believe me, I don't remember very many of the old hymns either, but it was sung. They were sung because everybody at that time, they sung out of a hymnal. And you would have them, and look like to me as a child, those hymns would go forever. There would be no end to them at all. And by me, many young people, they wanted to get out and go play ball, but we couldn't play ball on Sunday. So what we'd have to do is go and hide away down in the vacant lots of fields, I should say, and that's the only way we played ball. And during the same time, the Holiness Church was, they had a revival. And what happened, a lot of our young people from here, they went to the Holiness Church and they got saved, but they were still, some of them still going to church here, but they got saved, especially our boys. And then we didn't have a ball team. That was miserable. It was very miserable. But from there on, you know, we grew up and everybody got themselves settled in as they became adults and everything like. But it was a beautiful life back in there. And everybody, I go back to farming again, that everybody had farms. And when they would have church dinners, church lunches, church anything, everybody in the community would tip in because they didn't have to do nothing but go in at corn houses and feed stores and things like that and get the food out and cook it. They didn't have to go and buy it. And I remember when two ministers that came out, they wanted to be ministers that came out, and they went to the seminary. And there was a Bishop Smith, that was one that really noted this church here, and the other one was Lafayette Griffin. And in the meantime, they was going around at that particular time because they wanted to go off, and nobody had money. And they would go and they would come back collecting quarters and 50 cents and whatever the people could give to send these men off to school. And you wouldn't believe it. It became a wonderful, wonderful place after that. And he came back home. He contributed so much to this community, from namesake and financially too. He contributed a lot back to this church. And a young man that's sitting here now, his grandmother, Mrs. Gabriella Stephen, and she was one of the, you wouldn't believe it, in her writing, that she was right like she was an artistic person. That was and she was a secretary of the church for many, many years. And her writing, you couldn't believe it. It looked like it was, I can't even describe it how it was, just her writing alone. And it was most amazing how people were so talented. That's one thing about the community itself. Everybody had some talent, and the thing, they utilized it for everybody to help everybody in their lives. And this is the way I remember things as long as I can remember back. If one couldn't do one thing, another one could do, and they were just constantly helping each other. And that's one reason I tell you, we had white all around us, but it wasn't no such thing as a white have and you didn't have. If they had, you had. If you had, they had, you know. And that was life, that was life. But Mr. Percy Clark and Mr. Ed Brown, and that was one thing about Mr. Ed Brown, was always the one that would ring the bell. Would tone the bell if any serious thing was happening in the community, and always on Sunday the bell would ring, and the bells here was one thing that you always could rely on. And over at the United Methodist, I do believe on 59, they had a bell out there too, and we could hear it over here, and they could hear our bells out there, you know. So it was amazing back in the old days. But to the old wooden church there, you see that old wooden church, they would come to church with white, and sometimes they'd have to bring their shoes and change shoes at the church door before they came in, so the shoes wouldn't be wet, because like they was mentioned before, that we had no blacktop, no pavement, or no anything, and everything was roads and mud holes. There was this a trail, horse trails and cattle trails, you know, that we walked into, but they would get dressed to come to church. They would get dressed just like they're going to some audacious, not word before it, but some church that, you know, was sitting up on a big hill someplace. So that's what they felt. Religion was so, people were so involved in religion until they had to do the best they could in every respect. They had to do the best they could to be a part of the church once they're there. Even the singing and everything they did in church. And people be happy. And we used to go to the Triumph Church after we leave from Methodist Church. And they, at 9 and 10 o'clock at night, they had the windows open and everything. And everybody was singing and shouting and having a wonderful time in church, religiously time in church. And it was really a beautiful thing. And that's about as far as I can go as of now.
Hello, I'm Lawrence Stephen, and I'm a former pastor here of the AME Zion Church. And not only that, but while I was in grade school at the Vaughn Junior High School here in Stockton, Alabama, I attended school in the old building that we had in the AME Zion Church in third grade and the 7th grade. I'd like to say something about the AME Zion movement. The AME Zion movement is a very progressive type movement. And the reason I heard some of the one telling you about make sure you put the AME Zion on it, because all of the Methodist movement came out of James and John and Charles Wesley. They were the sons of Mr. Susanna and Samuel Wesley out of England. So all Methodists are Methodists, but because in New York they had a church and they would not allow the black preacher to preach. So they segregated, had the black sitting in the back, not able to do anything, and the black were moved by the Spirit of God to preach God's word. And it was sometime later that they formed a group and they pulled out from that church and formed their own church. And for a number of years, they could not preach, but once they pulled out, they formed their church and they called it the Zion movement. Amen. And they followed the teaching of John and Charles Wesley. So I'm grateful for that. The Zion is called the Freedom Church. And I'm grateful for the Freedom Church today. It has helped me to be free. I heard people talking about other church, talking about the holiness church. Zion is a holiness church. Charles taught that conversion is beginning on the road to Christian perfection.
Good morning. My name is Otis Harris. I'm a trustee of the church, a former trustee in years past because I quit for a while. I was an usher, class leader, which the class leaders, members were divided up into different classes, and I was one of the class leaders for a number of years. I left driving trucks, so I let it all go because I was never back home. Back in 1980, the trustees boards, along with the pastor, had got together after we had a big windstorm one Sunday, and everybody sitting in church, the musicians was playing, they having a good joyous time, but the whole while we were sitting there, you could hear the church squeaking. So the trustees got together and decided that we needed to do something. It's time for a move. So in the period of time, it took us a month or two to get all the figures together and get contractors and stuff together so that we could get it done. And we did what you almost see now. It had been renovated since then, but we got it to what it is outside is what it is today. Well, back in the day, all the old members of the trustees, the men's and all of the church, we all got together when they was working. They didn't have to use no outside help. All the help was within the church and the community. And they always had prayer service and stuff before they got to working. Because we always put the God first before we got to doing anything. Because He is the Almighty. And like I said, during my class leadership, I had several old guys and women too that decided they didn't no longer want to be bothered with the church because of the pastor. They didn't get along with him. They didn't like what he was doing and stuff. And I personally went to him and had prayer and talked to him and all and got them all to come back to join the church back before they left, before they went home today. And I am a living witness of miracle. I come from Mississippi one night. I worked at Pascagoula in Mississippi. I drove from Mississippi one night through prayers from the pastor, family members, and other members in the church. I had 990 sugar. I drove myself home one night by following car lights and got up next morning and drove myself back to the doctor after praying and going on all night. And the doctor told me when I got there, after he checked me out and said, how did you get here? And I said, me and my father, we come here. He said, who is your father? Where is he? I said, the Lord. And he said, he looked at me again, he rechecked my sugar again. He said, I'm going to send you to the hospital. I said, no, I'm going to drive to the hospital because me and my father came here so we can go further because he said he's going to be with me to the end. So I went to the hospital. I spent a week over there getting my sugar down, and after then, and that was 4 years ago. As of today, I'm on no medication. No diabetes medication, no blood pressure medicine, or nothing. So from this church and surrounding churches with prayer and hands-on with each and every one, Lord is a survivor and He will get you through. All you got to do is trust in Him.
Now, just to say something about the church currently, if you'll notice some of the pictures that are sitting around, this is the church of the past. Starting on my left side over there where you see all of the young people, this was once our youth choir. At one time, we had 46 members in our youth choir. That we cared so much about them and they were so gifted and talented. These other pictures are excerpts from the choir at different times, at different intervals. But we journeyed all the way to Salisbury, North Carolina with that youth choir. They served as hosts to our general conference, which is the largest body of collection of the church known as Zion Fountain, AME Zion Church, and its membership, because Zion is a big organization. My pastor has already explained some of that to you, but this choir right here, 46 members of it, journeyed to Salisbury, North Carolina, to Livingston University. That's the name of the church that they were the host, served as host choir. We ran into a little problem when we got there. People thought, well, they're from a little country church. They're not going to be able to handle the pressure of singing in this kind of an audience. Well, them not knowing, but us believing that our children were prepared, they did allow them to sing. When they sang, they lit up the auditorium. The bishop who was presiding at that time did not let them take a break. They sang through the whole General Assembly. We were very proud of them. I'm still very proud of our young people, still very proud of our choir. You see other pictures of our young people who have been members of this church over the years, and some adults. But right here, I want to concentrate on the picture of the old original Zion Fountain. If you'll notice, it's completely different from this current structure. On the left side of those two steeples you see extending, we had a church bell. At that time, when this church was in existence and when I was a child, there were no communication outlets. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have telephones. We had very few electric lights. However, when someone passed in this community, that bell would tone 3 times, and you could hear it throughout the community. So when that bell rang, it was a signal that someone in this community had passed on. So this church was very significant in the information outlet for this community because everybody knew. They wouldn't know who until they gathered to one another's house or they met in the streets and talked about it, but there were no phones, just a communication through a tolling of the bell. I want to speak on behalf of Mr. Leslie Kelson. In this old building, he basically was a carpenter at the time. He and a man by the name of Mr. Stevens, they did a lot of repairs to this church, to the old church. They kept it going. They kept it afloat. We had wooden floors. One thing I can remember as a child is I used to love to see the old women of the church get filled with the Holy Spirit, and when they did a little jig, and they would step so hard you could hear them throughout the whole church because they'd be dancing. I mean, they could strut, but the Holy Spirit had them. And I can also remember when my mother and my sisters and my brother would walk to church by way of not candlelight, not flashlight, by lighted light. We had a stick of lighter, and if you don't know what that is, it's a fat part of a pine tree that when you ignite it, it catches up and it won't go out easily. So we used to actually walk to church at night by that light. And we would put them out when we got to the church, and on the way out, we would pick them up again, relight them to return home. Those are fond memories of growing up in this church. Since then, of course, I have witnessed many, many pastors. In my youth, I can remember Reverend Johnson, who pastored this church for several years, and then I remember Reverend Sinkfield, who was definitely here for a few years, but the longest serving pastor that I can recall in this church was the Reverend R.L. Dockery Jr. He served some 25 plus years as pastor. That's very rare for a Zion Connection church because usually the bishops will move pastors around. However, under his tutelage, we made a lot of progress. He was also pastor when that youth choir that I mentioned earlier made that trip to North Carolina.
Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And it was started many years ago and was built by the hand of man going out, cutting down trees in the wood and sawing them up, making their own lumber, making their own timber. This has been passed down through generations by the men of this community. And I'm grateful for the AME Zion Church for all that it has done for our area and is doing for our area to this present time. Now, my experience has been that it has weathered the storm down through the years. I'm grateful that we have had everybody in this community is connected one way or another. Some of the founding father of the AME Zion Church have been John Howard York, Louis William Sr., John D. Williams, the Griffins, Cubby Anderson, Gus Pitt, Isaac Stevens, the Fields, Henderson Field, everybody in Stockton Moses came through this church. And I'm grateful for the AME Zion Church. This church has been a pillar for the growth and education of the people of our community. From this church, we have had many to go on to become doctors. Dr. Harvey Hamilton, Richard Smith, Columbus Smith. You heard other name of Mrs. Anna O. Jordan, Mrs. Carrie Harvey. You heard so many people came this way. And I'm happy because I'm a product of this church. I'm now living and thriving because I've used the shoulders of other people of this church. And I've seen Reverend Sankfield, Reverend Hood Johnson, Reverend Walker, so many people come through this way. And this church, whenever the school building in the Baltimore County education system did not have enough classroom to house the people, the school utilized the church building as a classroom to teach and educate its students.
The church is sitting in the same spot. What we did, we demolished the church and then built around it. And we spent weeks, months to doing that. And at the time we had church partially in here while we first started. And then till we got so that we took the roof off, I think we had it over the center over there. Because you're talking 20 years ago. We had to borrow money, but the most of the work was done through me and some others. But we had to have some contractors to do the bricks. We had a guy that we had to get to do the wiring along with me because, it was a task. It took us about a year to get it back completed. We had, like I said, Miss Leslie Kelson. He was a carpenter. He was a wood maker. And he and I, we took it and made they had a wooden rail all the way around the pulpit. We constructed that back and put it back up and made the arches for the windows, because we had square windows in it, and we got the arch windows, and we made all the covering for the arch and all that. Helped do the carpet and everything else from the past. Well, all I can say was mostly when we was out here working, that we worked. Like I said, we was having church while we was working. We had one sister of the church, every day she would come over at lunchtime and get somebody to bring her over, and she'd bring all those lunch and basket lunch and just have a good time. And back in the days, so I've been told that that's the way the old folks did when they built the original church over there in the cemetery. My great-great-grandfather was one of the pastors after the church was established over there. So I'm a descendant of all that, but I'm not a preacher. I do believe in the Lord, and I know He'll get you through if you trust in Him.
My mother grew up in this church, as well as insisting that her children serve this church in every capacity. She has served on the usher board. Matter of fact, she was president of the usher board for many years. She served as a deaconess until her passing away in 2015. She has always been a worker for the church. If there was any need of anything that she saw that needed to take place in this church, she was a willing worker. She was very instrumental in training up the children in this church, because when she looked at them, if they were out of order, if they were chewing gum, if they were squirming around on the seat, it stopped immediately. She didn't have to get up and move. She could just give me the look. She could give any child in this church, especially her own children. We were not allowed to look back when that door opened. You know, if that door opened and you decided you want to look back and see who came in that door, you're going to be dealt with. My mother would deal with us very severely. So I loved her. She was a pioneer in this church. I can remember her telling me about some of the older pastors that ended up getting themselves in a little trouble in this church, and how some of the older men dealt with them. I won't go into detail, but it was some severe punishment for pastors who came to this town and tried to rule the church in an unruly fashion. And my mother has told stories about some of those events. There are many other things that I can say about this church, but the main thing that I want to press forward is we are a historical church. We've been in existence now for 146 plus years, because we will be celebrating our 147th year anniversary this year in August. And only God could sustain a body of people with the same or similar beliefs that length of time. I've seen many, many changes. I've seen many, many spirits lifted. I've seen people who are healed by the Spirit of the living God. I've seen people whose lives have been changed. My life has been changed. I no longer do the things that I once loved to do, but God has dealt with me through the matriculation in this church, through the spirit of love, through the spirit of fellowship that exists in this church. We host many programs in this church that are instrumental and helpful to the community. We have a food drive that is in partnership with the Potter's Pantry of Spanish Fort, Alabama, and we do a vacation Bible school every year for the whole community, not just for members of this church. It's very successful, very informative, and very well attended. We also have started to do a career advancement day in February of each year in recognition and in honor of Black History Month, because what we are doing is we're trying to promote our youth into knowing that there's nothing impossible with God and with proper preparation. So we're very proud of our activities. We're very proud of our church growth. We're very proud of our history and our heritage. We never forget where we came from, though. We remember the struggle. We're still part of the struggle. On the civic side, this church is very instrumental in the promoting of those persons who lead our county, who lead our country, and who are instrumental in the day-to-day policies that we have to live by. But we want to make sure that we prepare our young people, excite our older people, and nourish everyone that is a member of this body called Zion Fountain AME Zion Church to know that without God, we're nothing.